Hello everyone. This is the promised video supplement to episode 182, The Search for the Beanfield, in which I will give some more visual context to the audio of that episode. What follows is a shortened and adapted version of that episode's script. But first, my standard reminder that the Watership Down podcast is intended for listeners who are familiar with the plot. There will be spoilers. I began planning for Site Visit 2 in April of 2022. I planned for this visit to start here, at the southern bank of the River Enbourne, right by where the last visit had ended. It would then have covered the Beanfield, the road, Newtown Church and Common, and possibly also Cowslips Warren. However, in this virtual site visit we are only going to focus on one thing, the location of the Beanfield that appears in chapters 9 and 10 of Watership Down. In the original novel of Watership Down, there are 4 boundaries mentioned between the River Enbourne and the road, as Hazel scouts out the landscape between them. In my beloved 1978 Puffin edition of Watership Down, the first of these occurs in the second paragraph of chapter 9, The Crow and the Beanfield, on page 50. It reads, quote, "He came to a wide gap which had been trodden into mud by cattle. He could see them grazing in the next field further up the slope." End quote. The second boundary is on page 51 in the middle of the third paragraph. Quote, "Fascinated, he ran to the crest. Nearby was another hedgerow, and beyond, moving gently in the breeze, stood a field of broad beans in full flower." End quote. This is obviously a description of Hazel finding the space in which the beanfield lies. The third boundary is mentioned in chapter 10, The Road and the Common. It is on page 57, one sentence into the second to last paragraph. Quote, "He looked cautiously out from among the beans and then darted into the hedgerow. The wind, as he stopped to sniff it, was reassuring, carrying only the scents of evening dew, may and cow dung. He led the way into the next field, a pasture." End quote. And a fourth and last boundary is mentioned on page 58 at the start of the third to last paragraph. Quote, "They ran on and crept through the hedge. Hazel looked down at the road in astonishment. For a moment he thought that he was looking at another river, black, smooth and straight between its banks. Then he saw the gravel embedded in the tar." End quote. This is the view of that fourth boundary on Google Earth, looking from the road the rabbits cross after they leave the Beanfield. The B4640 as it approaches the A339 at Newtown, just south of Newbury. As you can see, we have a limited view through the gate of the landscape beyond. So then, that is the evidence that Richard Adams provided us with in the book for the location of the Beanfield within this landscape. So what about the geography of the place? In episode 59 of this podcast, published in April 2022, I thanked 2 listeners and welcomed them to the Owsler. They were Chris Boyce and Solveig Singleton. At that point, Site Visit 2 was still very much a possibility, and I was very interested in getting as much advice and information as possible. On the smaller of the 2 Watership Down fans groups on Facebook, Chris had pointed me to an invaluable resource that would enable me to compare Ordnance survey maps of the locations from the book. This turned out to be absolutely crucial. The site is the National Library of Scotland and can be found at maps.nls.uk. As for Solveig, well, on the larger of the 2 Watership Down fans groups on Facebook, she made a simple suggestion that kind of unlocked the mystery of where the Beanfield might be in that landscape. Their comments were in response to an appeal I'd put out as I tried to prepare for Site Visit 2. My appeal, posted on the 11th of April 2022, was as follows. Quote, "I'm trying to trace the exact location of the Beanfield in chapters 9 and 10 of the book, but I've hit a problem. I'm missing a hedgerow. In this picture is what I think is the route the rabbits take from the Enbourne to the road, including 3 hedgerows. The fields are very narrow, and I cannot see traces of a hedgerow that has been taken up." End quote. I included a picture from Google Earth of the landscape in question, along with arrows indicating what I assumed was the route the rabbits took from the river to the road. Chris Boyce's suggestion of checking old Ordnance survey maps was an excellent one, but it just deepened the mystery. because the field boundaries of this small area had remained basically completely unchanged since the beginning of the 20th century. As you can see from this map produced in the 1900s, and this version that covered the years 1937 to 1961. And this is the current version in use in 2024. Which meant that the present landscape was fundamentally exactly the same as that which Richard Adams, born in 1920, had known in his childhood and teenage years as he explored the landscape that would one day become the setting of his first novel. So where was the missing hedgerow? I made the assumption that the route the rabbits took from river to road was a straight line through these hedgerows, but this only provided 3 boundaries, not 4. What's more, the space between the second and third boundary is a very small space in which a bean field of the kind described in the book looks as if it would barely fit. In making this assumption, I could have been accused of linear thinking. It just looked like the shortest route to the road. However, Solveig Singleton earned her Owsler membership at one stroke with this simple suggestion. Quote, "I don't read the text as referring to 3 hedgerows. One of the references might be off to one side, end quote. She also made the observation, quote, "I figure rabbits don't go in straight lines," end quote. And at one stroke, I started to look at this landscape in an entirely different light. Why should the beanfield lie in a direct line between the river and the road? I began to look at the area on the other side of the hedgerow that ran south-east from the river. This seemingly contains a large area of pasture, with no equivalent hedgerow to the first one described in the book, the only boundaries being a continuation of the hedgerows by the road and the one to the northwest of that. This, crucially, provided a plausible 4-boundary route from river to road, provided that the route involved a right-angle turn to the southwest after the first boundary, arriving at the beanfield through the second boundary, followed by a turn back to the southeast when leaving the beanfield, followed by the third boundary. Given Hazel's having been guided by the smell of the beanfield, as well as no explicit reference to the route continuing in a straight line, and also the proposed space of the beanfield now being very large, the solution suddenly seemed so obvious. And this remains my conclusion as to where the beanfield lies in the book to this day. It goes without saying that if you have any information that may help to improve on any of what I have said, please do get in touch via the usual channels, because I want to get this right. So, was this a beanfield in Richard Adams' early life, or indeed later in his life when he was writing Watership Down? We may never know. But despite not being one of the best known locations in the book, it does remain one of the landscapes described in the most detail in the whole story. It is tempting to think that there was a reason for that, such as, for example, Richard Adams having a childhood memory of a large fragrant beanfield as he wandered the landscape close to where he lived. A landscape he would one day immortalise in his first novel, Watership Down.